Coral reefs are these amazing structures that can be seen from space, but they're created by these tiny little organisms, and they create a home where a wide array of organisms can flourish. It's thought that up to half of all species in the ocean spend at least part of their life cycle in coral reefs, and it's unclear what will happen to all of these species if we lose coral reefs. The potential for mass extinction is real. Coral reefs are not only important for the species that live there, but coral reefs are also critically important for the communities that depend on these ecosystems for their livelihood. For subsistence communities, often they depend on coral reefs for fishing. More advanced economies depend on coral reefs for tourism. Nearly all of the carbon dioxide we emit to the atmosphere out of smokestacks or the tailpipes of our cars will eventually be absorbed by the oceans. In the ocean, this carbon dioxide molecule reacts with seawater to form carbonic acid. And this carbonic acid attacks the shells and skeletons of clams and corals and will ultimately threaten their survival. We performed an experiment in the Great Barrier Reef where we added an antacid to the water to counteract ocean acidification, and then let this water flow over a coral reef, measuring the growth rate of this reef. And we found that adding an antacid to seawater helped the reef to grow faster than it would have otherwise. Our experiment showed two important things. First, we showed that ocean acidification is already negatively impacting coral reef growth. But we also showed that, at least for individual reefs, something could be done to help the reef grow more strongly. If we're going to understand what ocean acidification is doing to coral reefs in the future, we need a standard set of measurement protocols that can be replicated in coral reefs throughout the world. Hopefully, humans will have the good sense to greatly reduce our carbon dioxide emissions so that coral reefs can thrive well into the future.
A continuación, invitamos a subir al escenario a la señora Yolanda Kakabadse, Presidenta de la World Wildlife Fund, quien moderará el panel Acidificación del Océano.
Who will be speaking to us about ocean acidification.
1 minuto después de las 12. Buenas tardes.
1 minute after 12. Good afternoon. Acidification. This is a term that few understand, and few suspect the seriousness and the implications of acidification. We have a first-class panel formed by people who are studying the science of acidification. I would like to call on the speakers who will share their experience and knowledge with us. Dr. Rodrigo Torres from the Centro de Investigación en Ecosistemas de la Patagonia, Chile. Dr. Ann Cohen, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, United States. Dr. Jean-Pierre Gattuso, National Center for Scientific Research, France. Christy Goldfuss
De la Casa Blanca.
From the White House.
La señora
Sigourney Weaver, who will be sending us a video message, and Fang Zhangmeng. Thank you for teaching me to pronounce your name. From the State Oceanic Administration of the People's Republic of China. I thank all panelists. Ocean acidification is one of the most relevant threats to the ecosystem. I will change to English out of respect for our panelists.
The ocean is changing faster now than at any point in tens of millions of years. We, the humans, are changing for the worse the ocean's chemistry. Continuing with business as usual will eliminate coral reefs and other crucial ecosystems by mid-century. That is only 35 years from now. The world's most diverse marine ecosystems can disappear. The impact this will have on many millions of people, on their food security and livelihoods, and their economy is worth 2.5 trillion of US dollars a year. 2.5 trillion US dollars a year. However, the ocean can recover if we take immediate action to ease the pressure. I was in New York at the UN Sustainable Development Summit last week, and I believe we are entering an era of unprecedented goodwill and commitment to put humanity on a different path, one that allows both people and nature to thrive. Our Ocean Summit, coming after the adoption of the SDGs, before the climate negotiations in Paris, is a key moment to think how we will achieve goal for to minimize and address the impacts of ocean acidification. If we don't address acidification, the other targets won't come true. So I invite our panelists of this morning, this afternoon, to speak about and share their knowledge with us, and then ask the audience to think how we are going to use that information to put it into action. Thank you.
Ocean acidification is produced by us. Our emissions of CO2 are not only changing the climate of Earth, but also the chemistry of oceans. A good part of our emissions into the atmosphere end up in the ocean, and consequently, when CO2 reacts to seawater, it forms an acid, carbonic acid. That acid globally affects the planet. A consequence of ocean acidification is that it dramatically reduces iron carbonate in seawater, which is essential for the formation of calcium carbonate, the mineral that makes up the shells and the structures of many sea creatures. The problem is that the acidic level of oceans has remained constant for millions of years. And on account of our CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, the ocean pH, which is how we measure the acidity, low pH means acidification, our release of CO2 to the atmosphere has reduced ocean pH to an unprecedented level. And the future outlook shows that acidic levels of the ocean will be so high that this will affect the life in the oceans without a precedent in the history of our oceans. The problem is that when pH declines and acidification increases, many organisms will begin to be seriously affected. For example, what we see on the screen is the shell of a minute marine creature that exists in the southern seas and is highly susceptible to pH changes. Ocean acidification not only corrodes this creature's shell when it's still alive, but it also has the potential of corroding everything that relates to this creatures' life. So ocean acidification is a global threat to all oceans and especially certain coastal systems that support human life. Ocean acidification will act in an isolated way. On the contrary, it will interact with many other stressors, such as, for example, climate change and particularly global warming, and the melting of polar ice. I am Chilean, and in this presentation, I would like to show you some effects of this interaction between climate change and ocean acidification, effects that could be caused to our coastline. Ocean acidification will interact with climate change on Chilean coasts. We know that the global ocean will increase its acidic level, and coastal waters will tend to be corrosive for this structure, calcium agamide, and so will place at risk our coastal societies. However, climate change will also affect coastal processes, such as in the case of Chile and of other systems. The intensity of the resurgent currents. These local phenomena will intensify the effect of ocean acidification in our seas, thereby putting at risk not only our natural resources, but also the future of aquaculture. Thank you. And to conclude, I would like to say that we must double our efforts to observe how ocean acidification evolves and be able to predict future effects of this on marine life. It is a major task and the only effective way of being able to somehow slow this process is to substantively restrict our CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Gracias, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for giving us the basis of what do we mean by ocean acidification. And Cohen will now speak to us of coral reefs. Why should we care?
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to introduce you, but I really need a slide changer. Thank you. I want to introduce you to a coral polyp. This is a tiny creature. It's barely visible to the naked eye. But it's evolved a remarkable capability to pull calcium and carbonate ions from seawater to build its own skeleton. And thousands of polyps, coral polyps, working together 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, work to build coral colonies. And this is a myriad of shapes and sizes that form the face of the living reef. Now, over countless thousands of years, the skeletons of millions of corals built by these tiny polyps, barely visible to the naked eye. Those skeletons coalesce to build what we know of as coral reefs. And because that polyp can pull ions from seawater to make a skeleton, a quarter of all marine species in the ocean have a place to call home. And 150,000 kilometers of tropical coastline are protected from waves and storms and tsunamis. And an estimated 500 million people all around the world have food. Because corals build reefs, goods and ecosystem services worth $375 billion a year provide to humans around the world. And we have a responsibility to protect these ecosystems. But these efforts to protect the ecosystems are under threat. Ocean acidification is occurring at a rapid pace. As carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere increase, the pH is declining. And together with that, the concentration of carbonated ions in seawater, those ions that those coral polyps need to build their skeletons, is declining. And you can see in this progression of images how the declining concentration of carbonated ions in seawater affects the ability of those coral polyps to build the skeleton that's needed to build the coral reef. Now, faced with this monumental and urgent problem, we have started a program across the Pacific Ocean in search of coral reef ecosystems that have figured out a way to deal with low pH conditions. And of the 20 or so coral reefs, this is a drop in the bucket, that we have studied so far, we have identified 6 that are existing under pH conditions equivalent to what's projected for the rest of the ocean by the end of this century. Now, the majority of these systems, 5 of the 6 that are living under naturally low pH conditions, show heavy negative impacts of that low pH. But in the far western Pacific, on a tiny coral reef archipelago called Palau, just within the last 2 years, we discovered coral reef communities thriving under conditions of pH expected for the rest of the ocean for the end of the century. They are living this pH now, and they are thriving. Based on what we know of these coral reef systems in Palau, we believe that there are more systems like it in the Central Pacific, in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Vietnam. There are coral reef communities that have evolved to deal with naturally low pH conditions. And our goal is to go in there, identify these naturally resistant reefs, and protect them, so that through processes of natural connectivity, these naturally resistant genes can repopulate neighboring coral reef ecosystems and ensure the survival of coral reefs into the future. What we need is a commitment from governments to fund these efforts, to allow access to these places where these resilient coral reefs are and to protect them, and to build scientific capacity across coral reef nations around the world so that scientists everywhere can work together in a global collaboration to ensure the survival of coral reef ecosystems into the future. Thank you very much.
Joanne, thank you for the passion also with which you speak about coral reefs. Just demonstrates the intensity of your work and the importance of your work. Christy Goldfuss from the White House Council on Environmental Quality will tell us what is the US doing. Now, Christy, in 6 minutes or 7 minutes, it's very difficult to tell us what the US is doing. So I look forward to that summary. Thank you.
Yes, well, I'm not going to talk about everything that we're doing, but I am going to focus on a few points. First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. Let's see if I can get this clicker right. It is just wonderful to be here with this distinguished panel and with all of you to talk about this incredibly important problem. Also, thanks on behalf of President Obama. I want to thank President Bachelet again for hosting this important conference, and to all the conference organizers who are responsible for this room. It is so important to be inspired by the space you're in as you're thinking about these very difficult challenges, and I think we would all agree that the aesthetics here are inspiring as we look at the problem and the task ahead of us. The ocean is a shared resource of all of our nations, and international gatherings like this are crucial to what we need to do to meet this challenge. That shared stewardship is what I would like to discuss today. A healthy ocean is essential to life on Earth and the well-being of all of our citizens. The world has begun to make important progress to come together to address climate change. But as you all know, few people really understand climate change's little-known twin, ocean acidification. If we're going to seriously address the impacts of ocean acidification that we can't avoid, then we need to help people outside of this room understand the urgency of the problem. As the previous presenters just showed, the facts make a compelling case. We know that 30% increase in acidity is what we're already experiencing, and it's harming species that are culturally, economically, and environmentally important, such as oysters in the United States and scallops here in Chile. These species support multi-generational family businesses, and they are an important part of our iconic coastal communities. Take the Taylor family from Shelton, Washington, for example. The Taylors are all too familiar with the negative impacts of ocean acidification on the oyster industry. Their business, Taylor's Shellfish, which opened in 1890, reached a In the Pacific Northwest of the United States alone, ocean acidification has cost the oyster industry an estimated $110 million and jeopardized thousands of jobs. It's these personal stories of impact that tend to unify people and leaders around collective action. And it's through the power of these stories that we can get people to understand how ocean acidification is impacting them. During his recent trip to Alaska, President Obama was asked about what helped him understand what's truly at stake in dealing with climate change and carbon pollution. In response, he talked about the oceans and the impacts to the fragile coral reefs of Hawaii, where he grew up. In other words, it hit home for him when he could literally visualize the impact of the place that he calls home. I'm going to talk some about where we are on the overall climate battle and the responsibility we have to connect that fight to oceans and tangible stories of the damage caused by ocean acidification. As all of you know, we're entering uncharted territory. Current projections for the end of this century predict a change in pH that the globe hasn't seen in the last 100 million years. The good news is that the international community has started to act collectively to address carbon pollution. Through action to cut emissions from our vehicles, power plants, and other sources, the US is on track to meet our 2020 target, and we have set a new ambitious goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. The best news is that as of this past weekend, more than 130 countries representing more than 80% of the emissions from the energy sector have put forward plans to reduce their emissions as well. We are cautiously optimistic that the UN climate discussions in Paris this December will put us on a path to avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. Leaders in the US and around the world were compelled to act in the face of devastating droughts, wildfires, and historic floods, and the mounting costs associated with that are getting them to respond. Just as you heard Secretary Kerry say today, this is what is motivating our world leaders. In order to understand and respond to the impacts of acidification, the US government spends roughly $20 million per year on programs, grants, and outreach. Today, however, we are announcing additional steps focused on acidification specifically. We are announcing efforts to create a new public-private partnership that would provide resources for African coastal states to monitor and better understand the impacts in the Indian Ocean. The U.S. will contribute resources to support training, and several foundations will join us to help African scientists acquire the ocean monitoring technologies they need. And over the next 5 years, we will also invest $21 million in the Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observation and Modeling Project, which develops, deploys, and analyzes the feedback of hundreds of floats armed with sensors, vital data to help us better understand the climate impacts. All of these steps help us share with all types of constituents the need for immediate and broad action. But my message to you today is that progress on emissions in Paris and our recent investments on ocean acidification are fabulous, but they're just not even close to enough to tackling this particular problem. In order to ramp up our efforts beyond Valparaiso and beyond Paris, those of us in this room need to reach a broader audience and tell a compelling story about what this means for our communities and the seas that we all love and enjoy. We need to translate the science we've been talking about today and make it tangible so citizens and leaders across the world can have those same aha moments that President Obama did when he learned what was happening to Hawaii's coral reef. And I think from the discussion even so far today, coral reefs are that unifying factor. My hope is that efforts like this conference will allow us to share data, science, but also stories, so we will be able to paint a clear and concise picture of why we need to act now. So I'll just end re-quoting the president from this morning in his comment to everyone. Ocean acidification, actually, I'm not going to end with his quote. I'm going to end with a quote from the Seattle Times. They referred to it as the ocean acidification has been referred to as the lesser-known twin of climate change. It's time for all of us to change that. And in order to address that problem, we must make it known so we can build the momentum and demand for greater action. I thank you so much for letting me speak today. I am so sorry that I'm going to have to duck out, but I'm running over to Congress to speak there as well. So good luck, and thank you to all the speakers and everyone today.
Hello. Thank you, Christy. Jean-Pierre Gattuso comes from the National Center for Scientific Research in France, and he's going to talk to us on ocean carbon dioxide uptake, ocean acidification, and its consequences.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Gattuso.
Monseigneur, dear friends of the oceans, I will try to put the ocean acidification issue in perspective with other climate-related issues. And before doing that, I will just remind everyone, it has been mentioned several times this morning, but reminds everyone why we want to protect the ocean. And